Beneath the moss-draped oaks of Wilcox County, Alabama, production records from Belhaven Plantation show an impossible surge in cotton yields during the spring of 1841, a 47% increase that defied every agricultural explanation of the era. What the ledgers don't reveal is the price 23 enslaved men paid for that prosperity, or why 17 of them would be dead within 8 months, under circumstances the county coroner refused to document. For over a century and 80 years, the Granger family descendants have guarded a collection of letters that expose a system of reward and punishment so disturbing it challenges our understanding of power, desperation, and human depravity in the antebellum South. Tonight, we uncover what really happened behind the white columns of Belhaven, where ambition wore silk and cruelty called itself mercy. Before we continue with the story of Belhaven Plantation and its widowed mistress, I need you to do something. If stories like this one, dark chapters of American history that refuse to stay buried, fascinate you as much as they haunt me, hit that subscribe button right now. And here's something I'm curious about. Where are you listening from tonight? Drop your state or city in the comments below. I want to know how far these forgotten American horrors reach. Now, let's step back into 1841 Alabama, where cotton was king and human souls were the currency of progress. The Alabama Black Belt earned its name from the dark, fertile soil that stretched across the central region like a ribbon of opportunity for those wealthy enough to exploit it. By 1841, Wilcox County had become one of the richest cotton-producing areas in the entire South. Its economy built entirely on the backs of enslaved labor and the ambitions of plantation aristocracy who viewed themselves as American royalty. Belhaven Plantation sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of this prime land, positioned along a gentle bend of the Alabama River, where steamboats could dock to collect bales of cotton bound for Mobile and New Orleans. The main house rose 3 stories high, its Greek Revival architecture a monument to wealth accumulated through generations of brutal efficiency. White columns supported a wraparound veranda where the Granger family had entertained governors, senators, and cotton factors who determined the financial fate of the entire region. But in February of 1841, Belhaven found itself under unusual management. Constance Granger, just 28 years old, had become the plantation's sole proprietor following the sudden death of her husband, William Granger III, who had succumbed to what the family physician diplomatically called an apoplexy of the brain, after a particularly heated argument with a rival planter over water rights. William's death left Constance in a precarious position, a young widow with no male heirs, substantial debts her late husband had concealed, and a plantation workforce that many believed no woman could properly manage. The conventional wisdom of 1841 Alabama society held that a woman of Constance's position should quickly remarry or appoint a male overseer to handle the brutal necessities of plantation management. Neighbors expected her to fail within a season. Her own brother-in-law, Preston Granger, had already begun circulating rumors that Belhaven would need to be sold to settle William's debts, positioning himself to purchase the property at a fraction of its value. Constance Granger, however, had not survived 28 years in the cutthroat world of plantation society by conforming to expectations. Born Constance Dalton in Charleston, she had been educated unusually well for a woman of her era. Her father, a shipping merchant, had insisted his daughters learn mathematics and bookkeeping alongside their needlework and French. She could calculate profit margins as accurately as any factor in Mobile, and she understood that her survival depended on one thing: production numbers that would silence every critic and secure her independence. The enslaved population at Belhaven numbered 63 souls in February 1841, divided among field workers, house servants, and skilled laborers who operated the plantation's cotton gin and carpentry workshop. Unlike many plantations where brutal overseers maintained discipline through systematic violence, Belhaven had operated under William Granger's particular philosophy of measured incentive, a system where additional rations, better clothing, or small privileges were offered to those who exceeded quotas. But Constance understood that her late husband's modest incentives had produced only modest results, and modest results would see her stripped of everything she had married into. The debts William had left totaled nearly $8,000, a sum that could only be addressed through a dramatic increase in cotton production. She needed her workforce to produce not just adequately, but extraordinarily, and she needed it immediately. In the overseer's cottage at the edge of the quarters lived Silas Drummond, a wiry man of 45 who had managed Belhaven's field operations for 7 years. Drummond represented the typical overseer class, poor white men who wielded authority over enslaved workers but remained firmly beneath the planter aristocracy themselves. He had expected Constance to defer to his judgment in all matters agricultural, perhaps even to increase his authority in William's absence. Instead, during their first private meeting in the plantation office, Constance had informed Drummond that his services would continue only if production increased by 40% before the summer harvest. The overseer had stared at her in disbelief, explaining that such numbers were impossible without literally working people to death, which would only decrease the plantation's long-term value. Constance had smiled then, an expression that never reached her pale blue eyes, and told Drummond she had her own methods in mind. Methods that would require his silence and cooperation, but not necessarily his understanding. The overseer would later tell his wife, in a letter discovered decades after these events, that something in Constance Granger's voice that day had made his blood run cold. Not anger or madness, but a certainty that suggested she had already calculated costs he couldn't begin to imagine. Among the enslaved population at Belhaven, 23 men worked the cotton fields under Drummond's supervision. They ranged in age from 16 to 52, their bodies bearing the marks of lifetimes spent in brutal labor. Like enslaved people throughout the South, they had developed their own social structures, hierarchies, and methods of survival within the nightmare of their existence. There was Isaac, a man of 34 who had been born on Belhaven and knew its fields with intimate precision. There was Caleb, just 19, recently purchased from a failed plantation in Georgia and still learning the rhythms of his new prison. There was Samuel, 41, whose skill at calculating the optimal time for harvesting had made him valuable enough to avoid the worst punishments. Each man carried his own story of loss, resilience, and the daily calculation of how to survive one more day in bondage. These men understood the brutal mathematics of plantation life. Work hard enough to avoid punishment, but never so hard as to raise quotas to impossible levels. It was a delicate balance, a form of resistance through measured compliance that had been refined across generations of enslavement. But in March of 1841, Constance Granger was about to introduce a variable into this equation that would shatter every survival strategy these men had developed. She was about to offer them something that would exploit the deepest human needs, desire, hope, and the illusion of agency within a system designed to strip them of all three. The spring of 1841 arrived early in Wilcox County, bringing warm winds that made the cotton plants flourish and creating optimal conditions for the growing season. In the big house, Constance began implementing her plan with methodical precision, starting with subtle changes that seemed almost benign to outside observers. She dismissed the elderly house servants who had attended the family for decades, replacing them with younger workers from the fields. She began taking her evening meals alone on the veranda, visible to anyone passing by the main house. She ordered new dresses from Mobile, not the morning black that widowhood demanded, but deep burgundies and forest greens that suggested a woman already looking beyond grief. The neighboring planters' wives whispered their scandals over tea, but Constance ignored them. She was not performing for them. Every choice, every visible change was calculated for a different audience entirely, the men whose labor she needed to increase beyond all reasonable expectation. What happened next at Belhaven Plantation would become a whispered legend in Wilcox County, a story too disturbing to fully document, yet too persistent to completely forget. It was a system that would indeed produce impossible yields, but at a cost that would echo through generations and raise questions about the darkest capabilities of human nature when power faces desperation. The change began on a Saturday evening in late March, when the work week ended, and the enslaved population gathered in the quarters for their brief respite before Sunday's half-day of rest. Silas Drummond appeared with an unusual announcement, his voice carrying across the packed earth yard between the cabins. "Mistress Granger has instituted a new system of reward," he declared, his discomfort evident in how he refused to meet anyone's eyes. "Each week, the man who picks the most cotton, exceeds his quota by the greatest margin, will receive a special privilege." The gathered people exchanged wary glances. They had heard promises of rewards before, extra rations that never materialized, privileges that vanished as quickly as they were granted. In the economy of enslavement, hope itself was often just another form of cruelty. But then Drummond continued, his voice dropping lower. "The man who produces the most will spend Saturday night in the main house, in Mistress Granger's quarters, at her invitation." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children stopped their playing. The words seemed impossible, a violation of every social boundary that governed plantation life. White women of the planter class existed in a carefully constructed mythology of purity and virtue, the very ideological foundation used to justify the entire system of racial slavery. The suggestion that a plantation mistress would willingly, publicly offer herself to enslaved men shattered fundamental assumptions. Yet Drummond was not finished. Production numbers will be posted each Saturday morning. The winner will be informed privately and expected at the main house after supper. This begins tonight. Isaac has picked 347 pounds this week, 23% above his quota. He is to present himself at the back entrance of the main house at 8 o'clock. Isaac, a solid man with graying temples and hands calloused from decades of cotton picking, stood frozen. Around him, others stepped back slightly, as if proximity to him had suddenly become dangerous. In the social calculus of enslavement, this distinction could mean many things, most of them perilous. "This is a trick," someone whispered. "They'll hang him for it." But as 8 o'clock approached, Isaac was escorted not to a whipping post or a noose, but to the rear entrance of the main house, where Constance Granger herself stood waiting. She wore a dress of deep green silk, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders in a style no respectable widow should display. A single lamp illuminated her face, and her expression held neither shame nor hesitation. "Isaac," she said simply, her voice carrying the same cool certainty it always held. "You've earned this reward. Come inside." What happened in those hours became a source of tortured speculation throughout the quarters. When Isaac emerged near dawn, walking back toward the cabins in the pre-morning darkness, men pressed him for details. But Isaac's face had transformed into something unreadable. Not quite shame, not quite pride, but a complicated mixture of emotions that defied simple categorization. He began, then stopped. It happened, exactly as promised. She treated me like I was a man who had earned something, like I had value beyond my labor. The words hung in the air, laden with implications that made everyone uncomfortable. In a system that reduced human beings to property, that denied enslaved men any claim to dignity or desire, Constance had offered something that felt almost like recognition. Not freedom, never that, but a twisted acknowledgement of humanity that was somehow more disturbing than outright brutality. And then, Caleb pressed, the young man's eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else he didn't want to name. "And then she thanked me for my excellent work," Isaac said quietly. "She said she looked forward to rewarding excellent work again next week. And she asked if I thought the others would work harder, knowing what was possible." The trap revealed itself in that question. Constance was not simply offering a reward. She was creating a competition, a system that would turn these men against each other in pursuit of something that mixed the promise of intimacy with the illusion of worth. She was exploiting not just their labor, but their deepest psychological needs, their hunger for any scrap of humanity in a system designed to strip it away. The following week, production numbers soared. Men who had previously picked 250 pounds daily suddenly brought in 300, 320, pushing their bodies beyond previous limits. The competition was not discussed openly, but everyone felt it. Caleb, young and strong, drove himself to exhaustion, his fingers bleeding from the sharp cotton bowls as he raced to fill his sack faster than anyone else. Samuel, the older man whose experience had always made him efficient rather than fast, found himself working through the brutal midday heat that he had learned to avoid. Even men who claimed to want no part of this degrading system found themselves unconsciously speeding up, driven by the visible effort of those around them. Saturday morning's posting showed Caleb as the week's highest producer, 362 pounds, a number that should have been impossible for someone of his relative inexperience. That evening, he too made the walk to the main house, returning before dawn with the same complicated expression that Isaac had worn. By the third week, the transformation of Belhaven's productivity had become undeniable. Drummond's daily tallies showed numbers that violated every agricultural expectation. Men were working 12, 14 hours in the fields, pushing through exhaustion and injury for a chance at Saturday night. But something else was happening too, something that Constance had perhaps anticipated or perhaps discovered with cold satisfaction. The social bonds that had sustained the enslaved community, the mutual support, the shared strategies of survival, the collective resistance through measured effort, began to fracture. Men who had worked side by side for years now regarded each other as competitors. Small sabotages appeared, a torn picking sack, a misplaced water gourd that cost precious minutes. Arguments erupted over real or imagined attempts to inflate numbers or slow down rivals. The overseers, who had once struggled to maintain discipline through violence, now watched as the enslaved population disciplined itself in pursuit of Constance's reward. In the main house, Constance maintained meticulous records not just of cotton production, but of her Saturday night visitors. In a leather-bound journal that would later be discovered hidden in a false bottom of her writing desk, she documented each encounter with clinical precision, not the intimate details, but the psychological observations. Isaac, grateful, almost worshipful, useful, will work himself to death for repeated access. Caleb, hungry for validation, responds well to praise. Potential for greatest productivity increase. Samuel, conflicted, ashamed, but unable to resist. This internal struggle makes him more valuable. He will push harder to justify his participation. The journal revealed Constance's system not as impulsive depravity, but as calculated psychological manipulation. She had identified that enslaved men, stripped of all other forms of agency and dignity, could be controlled through the offer of intimacy that carried the illusion of choice and the veneer of human connection. She was not acting on desire, but on a ruthless understanding of how to exploit desire in others. By mid-April, 17 different men had earned their Saturday night, some multiple times. The production numbers that Constance sent to her cotton factors in Mobile were so extraordinary that they prompted written responses questioning their accuracy. When factor representatives visited to verify, they found the numbers confirmed. Belhaven was indeed producing at unprecedented levels. But those visitors also noted other changes. The enslaved population seemed strangely divided, lacking the usual signs of collective identity. Men worked in isolated determination rather than cooperative rhythm. The singing that typically accompanied field labor had diminished, replaced by grim silence, broken only by the sound of cotton being torn from plants with desperate speed. One visitor, a factor named Robert Hendricks from Mobile, mentioned in a letter to his wife that the atmosphere at Belhaven felt unwholesome, as if some fever had gripped the workers, driving them toward productivity but draining something essential from their spirit. Hendricks could not have known how accurate his assessment was, nor could he have imagined the true source of that fever. Because by late April the first death occurred, a man named Joseph, 36 years old, who collapsed in the field during the hottest part of the day. The plantation physician Dr. Ephraim Caldwell attributed death to heart failure brought on by exertion in excessive heat, but Joseph's death was notable for another reason. He had been the previous Saturday's winner, had spent his reward night with Constance just 4 days before his collapse, and he had been heard telling others that he would win again, that he would do whatever necessary to earn another night in the main house, where he was treated like something more than property. The whispers began in the quarters the night after Joseph's burial in the Plantation cemetery, a segregated corner of the grounds where enslaved people were interred with wooden markers that rarely bore even their names. The women, who had watched this system unfold with increasing alarm, gathered to speak truths the men could not yet acknowledge. "She's killing them," said Ruth, a woman of 50 who served in the main house and had seen more than she wished. Not with whip or noose, but with wanting, making them kill themselves for a chance to feel human. "My Thomas came back different," another woman added, her voice breaking. "After his night. He won't speak of it, but he works now like a man possessed. Yesterday his hands bled through the bandages and still he wouldn't stop. I asked him why, and he said he needed to win again, needed to prove he was worthy." The psychological trap Constance had constructed was revealing its full cruelty. She had not just exploited physical desire, she had tapped into something deeper, the desperate human need for recognition, for worth, for some evidence that one's existence mattered beyond mere labor. In a system that reduced people to tools, she offered them a brief illusion of personhood, then made them destroy themselves, pursuing it again. But the women's concerns went beyond the psychological. Ruth had observed something else during her duties in the main house, something that added another layer of horror to Constance's system. "The mistress keeps a journal," Ruth revealed in hushed tones. "I've seen her writing in it every Sunday morning, recording details about each man who visits. Not as lovers, but as experiments. Like she's studying them, testing how far they'll push themselves." This revelation reframed everything. Constance was not a widow driven by loneliness or desire. She was conducting a systematic study of human behavior under extreme conditions. She had discovered that the promise of intimacy and recognition could drive productivity beyond what violence alone ever achieved. And she was documenting the results with scientific detachment. The spring progressed into early summer, and 3 more deaths followed Joseph's. Each man had been a recent Saturday night visitor. Each had pushed himself to extraordinary production levels in the days following. Dr. Caldwell, growing concerned by the pattern, attempted to discuss the matter with Constance. "Mrs. Granger," he said during a house call in late May, "I must express concern about the mortality rate among your field workers. 5 deaths in 2 months is highly unusual, even accounting for the exertions of harvest season." Constance had received him in the parlor, her demeanor perfectly composed. "Dr. Caldwell, I appreciate your concern, but surely you recognize that these men work of their own accord. I force no one beyond their natural capacity. If they choose to demonstrate exceptional dedication to their labor, should I punish such initiative?" The doctor had no answer. By the twisted logic of the system, she was correct. She was offering rewards, not demanding impossible quotas. That the men destroyed themselves pursuing those rewards could be framed as their choice, their weakness, their inability to resist temptation. "Perhaps," the doctor tried carefully, "the nature of the reward itself is inappropriate. A woman of your station offering such intimacies to enslaved men. The social implications alone." "The social implications, Doctor, are that Belhaven will produce record yields this season, securing my financial independence and silencing those who believed a woman incapable of managing a plantation." Constance's voice remained level, but her eyes held a warning. "My methods are my own concern. Unless you believe the deaths are caused by something other than overexertion?" Dr. Caldwell had retreated then, unwilling to openly accuse a white woman of the planter class of deliberately engineering deaths. But he confided in his own journal, later discovered by historians, that he believed Constance Granger had found a way to extract maximum productivity by exploiting the base natures of enslaved men, driving them to self-destruction through the oldest temptation known to mankind. His analysis, while deeply flawed by the racist assumptions of his era, contained a kernel of truth. Constance had indeed found a weakness to exploit, but it was not base nature. It was the profound human need for dignity, recognition, and worth, needs that the system of enslavement deliberately denied. She had offered a perverse fulfillment of those needs, then made the pursuit deadly. By June, Silas Drummond had begun to crack under the weight of his complicity. His wife, Martha, would later testify in a deposition that her husband had taken to drinking heavily, something he had rarely done before. He spoke of nightmares, of standing at the posting board each Saturday morning and knowing he was announcing a potential death sentence. "I'm tallying souls, not pounds of cotton," he told Martha one night, drunk enough to speak plainly. "She's found a way to make them volunteer for their own destruction, and I'm the one who rings the bell each week, calling them to the slaughter." "Then stop," Martha had pleaded. "Walk away. Find other employment." But Drummond knew, as did everyone in the plantation economy, that overseers who quit were rarely hired elsewhere. Constance had him trapped as surely as she had trapped her workforce, through economic necessity and the threat of ruin. Throughout this period, Preston Granger, William's brother and Constance's rival for control of Belhaven, had been watching developments with growing alarm. His initial satisfaction at expecting Constance to fail had transformed into concern as her production numbers reached unprecedented levels. The debts that should have forced her to sell were being rapidly paid down. His opportunity to acquire Belhaven at a discount was slipping away. In early June, Preston made a formal visit to Belhaven, ostensibly to check on his late brother's widow. He arrived to find the plantation operating with machine-like efficiency, cotton bales stacked for transport, fields meticulously maintained, everything suggesting exceptional management. But Preston was not fooled by surfaces. He had heard the rumors circulating through Wilcox County society, whispers about Constance's peculiar methods, and the suspicious death rate among her male field workers. During dinner, he attempted to probe the truth. "Your production numbers are quite remarkable, Constance," he said, cutting into the roasted duck she had served. "One might even call them miraculous. Surely you must attribute this success to some innovation in management?" "Innovation indeed," Constance replied with a slight smile. "I have simply learned to properly motivate my workforce, to offer incentives that inspire genuine dedication to their labor." Incentives. Preston let the word hang in the air. "I've heard certain stories about the nature of these incentives, stories that, if true, would scandalize the entire county." Constance met his gaze without flinching. "Stories told by whom, Preston?" "By envious competitors. By those who resent seeing a woman succeed where they predicted failure. I offer rewards for exceptional work, additional rations, better clothing, small privileges. If scandalmongers twist these innocent gestures into something inappropriate, that speaks to their corruption, not mine." The genius of her position was its deniability. She could publicly describe her system in vague, acceptable terms, while implementing something far more exploitative in practice. And who would contradict her? The enslaved men themselves, whose testimony held no legal weight. The overseer, who was complicit. The house servants who could be dismissed or sold at her whim. Preston left Belhaven that evening, frustrated and suspicious, but lacking concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Even if he had possessed proof, the mechanics of what Constance was doing existed in a legal and moral gray area. She was offering rewards, not inflicting punishments. That the rewards themselves became a form of torture was a subtlety that the law was not equipped to address. But Preston Granger was not finished. He began quietly investigating, speaking to factors, doctors, neighboring overseers, anyone who might provide insight into Constance's methods. He collected fragments of the story, the Saturday night visits, the competitive frenzy in the fields, the mounting death toll. And he began to assemble them into a case that he hoped would discredit Constance and finally give him control of Belhaven. What Preston did not yet understand was that Constance had been preparing for exactly this threat. Every detail of her system had been calculated not just for productivity, but for defensibility. And she had already taken steps to ensure that any investigation would reveal only what she wanted revealed, nothing more. The truth about Belhaven would not emerge through Preston's efforts, or through legal proceedings, or through any conventional exposure. It would come through a source no one anticipated, from within the system itself, from one of the men who had been both victim and participant in Constance's experiment. Isaac had won the Saturday reward 7 times by mid-June, more than any other man. His cotton production had become legendary throughout the plantation, numbers that seemed to defy physical possibility. But the cost was written across his body in weight loss, in the tremor that had developed in his hands, in the way his eyes had taken on a fevered quality that never quite faded. The other enslaved people watched Isaac with a mixture of awe and horror. He had become something like an avatar of the entire twisted system, the ultimate proof that Constance's rewards could drive a man to extraordinary achievement, and the clearest evidence of what such achievement demanded. But Isaac was also beginning to understand something that Constance had not anticipated. In those 7 Saturday nights, in the brief hours when he was treated as something other than property, he had observed things. Constance was careful to maintain her role during these encounters, to preserve the power dynamic even in intimacy. But small details slipped through, fragments of conversation, glimpses of documents left carelessly visible, moments when her calculated facade wavered just slightly. Isaac had seen the journal, not its contents but its existence, kept in Constance's bedside table and occasionally consulted before his visits. He had heard her speaking once to herself, words not meant for his ears. 17 deaths projected by August if current rates continue. Acceptable losses against projected yields. The revelation had struck Isaac like a physical blow. He was not earning rewards through his excellence. He was participating in a calculated system of exploitation where his eventual death was already factored into her projections. She knew what her incentives were doing to him, to all of them, and she had decided the profit justified the cost. In that moment, something shifted in Isaac's understanding. The shame and pride and desperate hunger that had driven him to destroy himself for Constance's recognition suddenly crystallized into a different emotion entirely. Rage. But rage alone was useless to an enslaved man in 1841 Alabama. Direct confrontation would mean death, likely by hanging or worse. Escape was nearly impossible from the heart of plantation country, surrounded by hostile territory for hundreds of miles. What Isaac needed was something more subtle, a way to expose the truth in a manner that would destroy Constance while protecting himself. He began to plan with the same methodical care that Constance had used to construct her system, and his plan centered on the one person who had both the power and the motivation to bring Constance down: Preston Granger. The challenge was communication. An enslaved man could not simply approach a white planter with accusations against a white woman. Such presumption would be punished severely, and his claims would be dismissed regardless of their truth. Isaac needed a method that would provide Preston with information while maintaining his own deniability. The solution came through literacy, a dangerous secret that Isaac had kept hidden for most of his life. His previous owner, before being sold to Belhaven as a young man, had been a relatively lenient Quaker who had illegally taught several of his enslaved workers to read and write, believing it a moral duty, despite state laws explicitly forbidding it. Isaac had guarded this knowledge carefully, understanding that literacy made enslaved people more valuable, but also more dangerous in the eyes of white society. Now, that forbidden skill became his weapon. Over several weeks in late June, working by dim light in the cabin he shared with 3 other men, Isaac composed a letter. He wrote in carefully disguised handwriting, attempting to make it appear as though it came from someone educated, possibly even white. The letter detailed Constance's system with clinical precision. The Saturday rewards, the competitive structure, the mounting death toll, and most damning, the existence of her journal documenting the entire experiment. The letter concluded with a simple suggestion. If you seek proof of these claims, examine the records of cotton production against the mortality rate of male field workers. The correlation will be undeniable. And search the mistress's chambers for a leather-bound journal, likely hidden, containing documentation of her systematic exploitation. Getting the letter to Preston required help. Isaac enlisted Caleb, who had earned his own Saturday rewards 3 times, and whose youth made him both desperate to believe in change and reckless enough to take risks. Together, they arranged for the letter to be placed where Preston would find it during his next visit to Belhaven, slipped into his coat pocket while it hung in the entrance hall, timed so that he would discover it only after leaving the property. The plan worked. Preston found the letter that evening, read it with growing astonishment, and immediately began to investigate its claims. The correlation between production and deaths was indeed undeniable when examined systematically, and Preston had enough social standing to request a private meeting with Dr. Caldwell, where the physician reluctantly confirmed his own suspicions about the pattern of deaths. But the journal, that would require direct action. Preston could not simply march into Constance's private chambers and demand to search them. He needed legal authority, which meant involving the county sheriff and potentially creating a public scandal that might damage the Granger family name as much as it damaged Constance. Preston spent sleepless nights weighing his options. The evidence was compelling, but also deeply disturbing. If the letter's claims were true, Constance had found a way to weaponize intimacy itself, to use the promise of human connection as a tool of exploitation more effective than any whip. The implications were staggering, not just for Constance's crimes, but for what they revealed about the machinery of slavery itself. While Preston deliberated, events at Belhaven were accelerating toward crisis. The Saturday competitions had grown increasingly frenzied as men fought for rewards with greater desperation. Minor injuries that workers would normally rest had become irrelevant. Men picked cotton with broken fingers, with fevers, with wounds that should have kept them in their cabins. On the first Saturday of July, something unprecedented happened. 2 men tied for the highest production, Isaac and a younger man named Daniel, who had recently become obsessed with earning the Saturday reward. According to the strict metrics of Constance's system, both had earned the privilege. Drummond, facing an impossible situation, brought the matter to Constance. Her solution was characteristically ruthless. Both men would be rewarded, but in sequence, with Isaac on Saturday night and Daniel on Sunday. The implication was clear. Sunday's reward was somehow less valuable, a second-place prize that carried its own shame. Daniel, driven by pride and the twisted logic of competition, pushed himself beyond all reason in the following week, determined to win outright. His production numbers soared, but so did the physical cost. By Thursday, he was coughing blood. By Friday, he could barely stand. On Saturday morning, he was dead. Dr. Caldwell, examining the body, could no longer maintain his professional detachment. Daniel's death was clearly the result of exhaustion and physical breakdown, his body literally consumed by overwork. The doctor confronted Constance directly in front of Drummond and several house servants. "This has gone too far," Caldwell declared, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "You are killing these men with your rewards. Whatever you're offering them, it's not worth their lives." Constance's response was chilling in its composure. "Dr. Caldwell, are you suggesting that I am forcing anyone to work beyond their capacity? Each man chooses his level of effort. I merely acknowledge excellence when I see it. If some cannot control their own ambitions, how is that my responsibility?" "You know exactly what you're doing," Caldwell shot back. "You've created a system that exploits their desperate need for humanity, for recognition. You're using their hunger for dignity against them. And whose fault is it?" Constance replied coldly, "That they hunger for such things. I did not create the system that denies them dignity. I simply operate within it, as we all do. You treat their bodies when they're broken. Drummond manages their labor. I own them. We all participate in this machinery, Doctor. Do not pretend that I alone am responsible for its cruelties. The argument contained a terrible logic. Constance was right that she operated within a system already designed to dehumanize and exploit. Her innovation was not the exploitation itself, but the method. Discovering that the promise of humanity could be more destructive than its outright denial. Ruth, who had witnessed this confrontation from the doorway, carried the story back to the quarters. The enslaved community now faced a horrible truth. Constance knew exactly what her system was doing. The deaths were not accidents or unintended consequences. They were calculated costs, acceptable losses in pursuit of unprecedented productivity. That realization broke something fundamental in the social structure of Belhaven's enslaved population. Men who had been competing for Saturday rewards began to openly question their participation. Arguments erupted between those who wanted to resist the system and those too deeply invested in it to walk away. Some had tied their entire sense of worth to their Saturday victories, and the suggestion that they abandon the competition felt like admitting that their sacrifices had been meaningless. Isaac watched this fracturing with anguish. His plan to expose Constance through Preston had not yet borne fruit, and meanwhile, the community was tearing itself apart. He realized that he needed to accelerate matters, to force Preston's hand before more deaths occurred. The opportunity came in mid-July, when Preston visited Belhaven again, ostensibly for a routine family visit, but actually to observe the plantation's operations more closely. Isaac managed to position himself working near the main house during Preston's arrival, close enough to make eye contact, to let the white man see the desperation and intelligence in his gaze, a calculated risk that could be dismissed as mere deference if noticed by others, but might register as significant to someone already primed by the anonymous letter to look for signs of the truth. Preston did notice, and that brief exchange of looks confirmed for him that the letter had come from within Belhaven itself, from someone with intimate knowledge of Constance's system. The realization added urgency to his investigation. Someone was risking everything to expose the truth, and Preston could not let that courage go to waste. That evening, Preston made his decision. He would involve County Sheriff James Holbrook, a man known for rigid adherence to law and a deep discomfort with anything that threatened the social order. Preston framed his request carefully, not as an accusation of impropriety, which might make Holbrook defensive of white womanhood, but as a concern about potential financial fraud. "I have reason to believe," Preston told the sheriff, "that my sister-in-law may be falsifying production records to inflate the apparent value of Belhaven. I request your presence as a witness while I examine the plantation's documentation to ensure the legitimacy of my late brother's estate." It was a masterful reframing. Financial fraud was a crime that threatened the entire plantation economy, something that demanded investigation regardless of who was accused. And Preston's status as family gave him legal standing to examine estate records. Sheriff Holbrook agreed to accompany Preston to Belhaven the following day. What neither man yet realized was that Constance had been anticipating exactly this move, had been preparing for it since the moment she first noticed signs of Preston's investigation, and her countermeasures were already in place. When Preston and Sheriff Holbrook arrived at Belhaven on July 18th, they found Constance waiting for them in the parlor, dressed in proper mourning black, her demeanor that of a grieving widow, cooperative with family concerns. She greeted them with appropriate deference, offered refreshments, and expressed complete willingness to open any records they wished to examine. "I have nothing to hide," she declared with perfect sincerity. "My management has been exemplary, and the records will prove it. Please, examine whatever you need." Preston felt the first stirring of doubt. Constance was too calm, too willing. A guilty person would show some sign of anxiety, some resistance to investigation. But he pressed forward, beginning with the production ledgers that Drummond maintained. The numbers were staggering, cotton yields that exceeded previous years by 47%, exactly as the anonymous letter had claimed. But the documentation was meticulous, verified by multiple witnesses including Drummond's signature and the marks of enslaved workers who had loaded each bale for transport. There was no evidence of falsification, only of extraordinary productivity. "Remarkable yields," Sheriff Holbrook observed, clearly impressed. "How did you achieve such improvement, Mrs. Granger?" "Through proper incentives and management, Sheriff," Constance replied smoothly. "I instituted a system of rewards for exceptional work, additional rations, better clothing, small privileges for those who exceeded expectations. It has proven remarkably effective." Preston seized on this opening. "What sort of privileges exactly?" Constance met his gaze without hesitation. "Time off from Sunday labor, additional food allocations, better sleeping quarters for the most productive workers. Simple things that acknowledge excellence without disrupting the social order." It was a complete lie, but one that was impossible to disprove without testimony from the enslaved workers themselves. Testimony that held no legal weight and could be dismissed as fabrication or coercion. Preston tried a different approach. "I've heard concerning reports about the mortality rate among your field workers. 17 deaths in 5 months seems excessive." "A tragedy," Constance acknowledged, her expression appropriately sorrowful. "Dr. Caldwell has examined each case. The causes were natural: heart failure, fever, exhaustion from overwork in some cases. I've actually been concerned that some of my workers push themselves too hard in pursuit of rewards. I may need to impose mandatory rest periods to protect them from their own excessive dedication." The answer was perfect. She acknowledged the deaths while attributing them to the workers' own choices, even suggesting she might need to protect them from themselves. And she had the doctor's reports to support her claims. Reports that, while documenting concerns, stopped short of accusing Constance of deliberate harm. Sheriff Holbrook was nodding along, clearly finding nothing improper in this explanation. Preston felt his case slipping away. The production records were accurate, the deaths were documented with medical explanations, and Constance's description of her incentive system sounded entirely reasonable on the surface. But Preston had one more card to play: the journal. According to the anonymous letter, it contained documentation of Constance's true system, evidence that would expose the reality beneath her careful lies. "I'd like to examine your personal records as well," Preston said carefully. "Any journals or private accounts you may keep regarding plantation management." For the first time, Constance's composure flickered, just slightly, just enough for Preston to notice. "My personal journals? Surely that's beyond the scope of examining estate finances." "Not if they contain information relevant to plantation operations," Preston pressed. "I have reason to believe you may keep detailed records of your management methods." Sheriff Holbrook looked uncomfortable now, torn between his respect for a white woman's privacy and his duty to investigate potential fraud. "Mr. Granger, do you have specific evidence that such journals exist and contain relevant information?" Preston hesitated. He could not reveal the anonymous letter without raising questions about his source. "I have received information suggesting—" "Anonymous accusations?" Constance interrupted, her voice sharp now. "Preston, if you wish to accuse me of wrongdoing, do so openly. But I will not have my private chambers invaded based on gossip and rumor." The confrontation had reached a critical point. Preston could push harder, could demand a search of Constance's quarters, but doing so would require revealing his source and might still be refused by the sheriff without more concrete evidence. The journal existed. He was certain of it, but proving its existence was another matter entirely. What Preston did not know was that the journal had been moved 2 days earlier. Constance, anticipating investigation, had given it to her most trusted house servant, Ruth, with specific instructions. The journal now rested in a location no one would think to search, buried in a sealed jar beneath the floor of Ruth's own cabin in the quarters. And Constance had taken another precaution. She had created a second journal, one she kept openly in her writing desk, filled with innocuous observations about plantation management, weather conditions, and crop development. If forced to produce a journal, she would provide this sanitized version, claiming it as the only such record she maintained. Preston, sensing defeat but unwilling to surrender entirely, made one final attempt. "Then, let me speak with your overseer and workers privately. Let me hear from them directly about these incentive programs and working conditions." "Of course," Constance agreed immediately. "Though I suspect you'll find their testimony supports exactly what I've told you. My methods have been transparent and effective." The interviews began that afternoon. Drummond, questioned by Preston in the overseer's cottage, confirmed the existence of reward systems, but described them in the same vague terms Constance had used. Yes, workers received privileges for exceptional production. No, nothing improper had occurred. The deaths were tragic, but attributable to natural causes and overexertion. Preston could see the fear in Drummond's eyes, the way the overseer's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. The man was lying, or at least concealing significant truths. But Drummond would not break, could not break, without destroying his own livelihood and reputation. The enslaved workers, when questioned, were even less forthcoming. They understood the danger of speaking openly about Constance's system. Some confirmed receiving rewards, others claimed ignorance of any special privileges. None would provide details that contradicted Constance's official story. But when Preston spoke with Isaac, something different happened. The older man's responses were carefully worded, staying within the bounds of what was safe to say, but his eyes held a message that Preston could not miss. A silent plea, a confirmation that the letter's accusations were true, a desperate hope that Preston would find a way to expose what words could not safely reveal. "The rewards Mrs. Granger offers," Isaac said slowly, choosing each word with precision, "they make a man willing to work himself to death, because sometimes what she gives feels more important than life itself. Even when you know the cost, you can't stop wanting it." The statement was ambiguous enough to avoid punishment, but clear enough to confirm Preston's suspicions. Constance was indeed offering something more than extra rations or better quarters. She was exploiting something deeper, something that made rational men choose self-destruction. Sheriff Holbrook, however, interpreted Isaac's words differently. "Sounds like these workers are simply dedicated to their labor. Nothing sinister in that, Mr. Granger. Seems to me your sister-in-law has found an effective management approach, even if it has some unfortunate side effects." Preston left Belhaven that evening frustrated and angry. He had been certain he would find evidence to expose Constance, but she had anticipated every move, had created layers of protection around the truth. The journal remained hidden, the workers remained silent, and even Drummond's obvious fear could not be proven as evidence of wrongdoing. But Preston was not finished. If he could not prove Constance's crimes through investigation, he would have to force them into the open through other means. And he had one remaining strategy, one that would require patience and careful timing, but might finally bring the truth to light. Meanwhile, at Belhaven, Constance celebrated her victory privately. She had successfully defended her system against investigation, had maintained the facade of respectability while preserving the reality of her methods. The Saturday rewards would continue, the productivity would remain extraordinary, and her financial independence would be secured. But Constance had made one critical miscalculation. In her focus on defending against Preston's investigation, she had failed to notice the growing desperation among the enslaved men themselves. The competitions had become increasingly frenzied, the pursuit of rewards more consuming, and some men, driven beyond reason, were beginning to consider actions that would have been unthinkable months earlier. The system that Constance had created with such calculated precision was approaching a breaking point, not because of external investigation, but because of internal collapse. Because human beings, even when exploited and controlled, eventually reach limits that no incentive can overcome. The breaking point came on Saturday, August 7th, during what should have been a routine posting of the week's production numbers. Isaac had won again, his 8th victory, a number that had come to represent both his extraordinary productivity and his slow destruction. But this time, when Drummond announced the results, something unexpected happened. Caleb, The young man who had been Isaac's closest competitor, who had won 3 times himself and had been pushing his body to its absolute limits, trying to surpass the older man, stepped forward with a challenge. "The numbers are wrong," Caleb declared, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "I picked more than Isaac this week. I know I did. I counted every pound." Drummond's face went pale. "The scales don't lie, Caleb. Isaac brought in 412 pounds. You had 397. Then the scales are rigged," Caleb shot back, his voice rising with desperation and rage. "Or someone's changing the numbers. Because I will not lose to him again, I cannot." The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Direct challenges to white authority, even an overseer's authority, typically resulted in severe punishment. But Caleb had been pushed beyond the instinct for self-preservation, beyond the careful calculations that normally governed enslaved people's resistance. The system had broken something essential in him, had driven him to a point where the reward mattered more than safety, more than survival itself. Isaac, recognizing the danger, tried to defuse the situation. "Brother, the numbers are what they are. There's no dishonesty here. You worked hard, but do not call me brother," Caleb snarled, turning on Isaac with sudden fury. "You're not my brother. You're my rival. You're the man standing between me and the only thing in this hell that makes me feel human. And I will not let you have it again." The gathered crowd fell silent, horrified by the raw emotion on display. This was what Constance's system had created, men so desperate for her recognition that they had turned on each other completely, that the bonds of community and shared suffering had dissolved into bitter competition. Drummond, understanding that the situation was spiraling out of control, made a decision that would prove catastrophic. "Both of you, calm down. This isn't—" But before he could finish, Caleb lunged at Isaac with a fury that shocked everyone. The younger man's fists connected with Isaac's face, and suddenly they were fighting, not the ritualized combat that sometimes occurred among enslaved men, carefully controlled to avoid serious injury, but genuine violence driven by desperate need and psychological collapse. Other men rushed to separate them, but the damage was done. Isaac's nose was broken, blood streaming down his face. Caleb's knuckles were split, and his eyes held a wildness that suggested he had passed beyond reason entirely. Drummond knew this could not be hidden, could not be smoothed over with quiet discipline. This was a public disruption of order, witnessed by dozens, that demanded public response. He had no choice but to bring both men before Constance for judgment. In the parlor of the main house, Constance listened to Drummond's report of the incident with an expression of calculated concern. Isaac and Caleb stood before her, Isaac's face still bleeding, Caleb trembling with residual rage and fear of punishment. "This is deeply disappointing," Constance said, her voice carrying the tone of a parent scolding children. "I have offered you rewards for excellence, incentives to improve your work and your conditions, and this is how you respond? With violence and accusations?" "Mrs." Isaac began, but Constance cut him off with a raised hand. "I will not tolerate such behavior," she continued. "Caleb, your accusations against Drummond suggest a lack of respect for authority that cannot go unpunished. Isaac, while you were attacked, your provocation through consistent victory has created this situation." The logic was twisted, blaming both men for the crisis that Constance herself had engineered, but it served her purpose, maintaining control while deflecting responsibility. "Caleb will receive 15 lashes, Constance declared, her voice cold, "to be administered tomorrow, Sunday, as an example to all. Isaac, you are barred from earning Saturday rewards for the next month. Perhaps that will allow others opportunity to achieve and reduce the tensions your success has created." The punishments were strategically chosen. Caleb's whipping would reinforce traditional discipline, reminding everyone of the consequences of challenging authority. Isaac's exclusion from rewards would intensify the competition among others, while leaving him desperate to regain access to the only thing that had made him feel human. But Constance had miscalculated the depth of despair she had created. That night, Caleb did not return to his cabin. Instead, he slipped away toward the river, his mind fractured by the realization that he would never again experience the Saturday reward, that the only thing that had given him worth was now forever denied. They found his body the next morning, floating in the Alabama River. Whether he had intended to escape and drowned in the attempt, or whether he had deliberately walked into the water seeking the only release available to him, no one could say with certainty. But his death brought the total mortality among Belhaven's male field workers to 18 in 6 months, a number that could no longer be explained away as coincidence or natural causes. Dr. Caldwell, examining Caleb's body, had reached his breaking point. He wrote an immediate letter to the county medical board, detailing his concerns about the pattern of deaths at Belhaven, and explicitly stating his belief that Mrs. Granger's management methods, whatever their exact nature, were contributing to an extraordinary mortality rate. The letter reached the medical board within days, and suddenly Preston Granger's earlier investigation took on new urgency. A doctor's formal complaint could not be dismissed as family rivalry or anonymous accusation. It demanded official response. On August 15th, a delegation arrived at Belhaven, Sheriff Holbrook, accompanied by 2 members of the county medical board, and despite Constance's objections, Preston Granger as representing the family's interests. This time, they came with legal authority to conduct a thorough investigation, including examination of any private records relevant to plantation management and worker welfare. Constance knew immediately that her carefully constructed defenses would not withstand this level of scrutiny. The sanitized journal in her writing desk might fool a cursory examination, but sustained investigation by multiple parties would expose its inadequacies. Questions would be asked that she could not answer without revealing the truth. She made a decision then, one that demonstrated the ruthless calculation that had characterized all her actions. If the system was going to be exposed, she would control the narrative of its exposure. She would admit to enough truth to seem cooperative, while framing her actions in the most defensible possible light. "Gentlemen," she said, gathering the delegation in her parlor, "I believe I understand the concerns that have brought you here, and perhaps it is time I spoke more openly about my management methods which have been effective but clearly misunderstood." She proceeded to describe a version of her Saturday reward system, acknowledging that she had offered personal attention to the most productive workers, framing it as a lonely widow's attempt to maintain morale through compassionate recognition. She admitted that some men had perhaps taken this attention too seriously, had worked themselves too hard in pursuit of her approval, but insisted this was never her intention. "I sought only to acknowledge their humanity," she explained with perfectly calibrated emotion, "to show them that excellent work would be rewarded with kind treatment, with recognition as individuals rather than mere laborers. If my methods were unconventional, it was because I believed kindness might achieve what brutality never could." It was a masterful performance, painting herself as compassionate but naive, well-intentioned but ultimately unsuccessful in her experiment with humanitarian management. She made no mention of the journal documenting her calculations, of the projected mortality rates she had deemed acceptable, of the systematic psychological exploitation. The delegation listened with varying reactions. Some seemed moved by her apparent remorse, others remained skeptical. But without access to the hidden journal, without testimony from enslaved workers that would carry legal weight, they could not prove deliberate malice. Preston, however, was not satisfied. "Where is the journal?" he demanded. "The one where you documented these methods in detail?" Constance looked at him with wide eyes, a picture of confusion. "I have my plantation management journal," she said, gesturing to the sanitized volume on her desk. "It contains records of crop rotations, weather observations, production notes. Nothing more." "That's not the journal I mean," Preston pressed. "I know you kept detailed records of your reward system, of your observations about individual workers." "I kept mental notes, certainly," Constance replied smoothly. Any good manager observes her workers. But I have no secret journal, Preston. I think your imagination has gotten the better of you. The search of Constance's chambers turned up nothing. The sanitized journal was examined and found to contain exactly what she had described. Routine plantation management notes. No evidence existed of the systematic documentation that Isaac's letter had described. But Preston had one final move. He requested permission to interview enslaved workers again, this time with the medical board present, under circumstances that might encourage more honest testimony. The delegation agreed, and that afternoon they gathered in the plantation office to question workers individually. Most repeated the same vague acknowledgments as before. Yes, there were rewards for good work. Yes, some men had pushed themselves too hard. No, nothing improper had occurred. The fear of speaking openly remained overwhelming, the risk too great. But then they called Ruth, the house servant who had witnessed so much from her position in the main house. And Ruth, burdened by months of watching men destroy themselves, by the knowledge of the hidden journal buried beneath her cabin floor, by the weight of complicity she could no longer bear, made a choice. "There is a journal," Ruth said quietly, her eyes downcast. A leather-bound book where Mrs. Granger recorded everything about the Saturday rewards, the real rewards. What she offered the men, how they responded, how far they would push themselves. She wrote it all down like they were animals in an experiment. The room fell silent. Constance's face went pale, then flushed with rage. "This woman is lying," she declared. "A disgruntled servant making false accusations. The journal is buried beneath the floorboards of my cabin," Ruth continued, speaking over Constance's protests. "Second board from the door in a sealed jar. Mrs. gave it to me to hide when Mr. Preston started investigating. Told me she would sell my children south if I ever spoke of it. But I cannot carry this secret anymore. Too many men have died." The delegation immediately dispatched Sheriff Holbrook to retrieve the journal from Ruth's cabin. The wait seemed endless. Constance sitting rigid and silent. Preston barely containing his vindication. Ruth trembling with the knowledge that she had likely sealed her own fate regardless of the outcome. When Holbrook returned with the leather-bound journal, sealed in a jar exactly as Ruth had described, the truth could no longer be denied. The medical board members read aloud entries that documented Constance's systematic exploitation in her own words. The calculated offers of intimacy, the observations about which men responded most strongly, the projections of mortality rates deemed acceptable costs of increased production. Isaac, grateful, almost worshipful, useful, will work himself to death for repeated access. Caleb, hungry for validation, responds well to praise, potential for greatest productivity increase. Projected 17 deaths by August if current rates continue. Acceptable losses against projected yields of 47% increase. The words hung in the air, undeniable evidence of deliberate exploitation, of human beings treated as experimental subjects in a study of how much suffering could be extracted through the promise of humanity. Preston felt sick as he listened, even though he had anticipated something like this. The reality, documented in Constance's precise handwriting, was worse than he had imagined. She had not been driven by loneliness or desire, or even simple cruelty. She had been conducting an experiment in the mechanics of exploitation, discovering that the hunger for recognition could be deadlier than any physical punishment. The aftermath of the journal's discovery moved with the slow machinery of 1841 Alabama justice, complicated by the unprecedented nature of Constance's crimes. She had violated no written law. There were no statutes against offering rewards to enslaved workers, no legal prohibition against intimacy with people one owned as property. The very framework of slavery created a legal void around such actions, as enslaved people were simultaneously recognized as property and as persons under criminal law, depending on which interpretation served the interests of white society. The county medical board issued a formal condemnation of Constance's methods, declaring them contrary to proper management practices and Christian morality. But condemnation was not prosecution. The question of what actual charges could be brought against her paralyzed legal authorities for weeks. Preston, frustrated by legal inaction, pursued a different remedy. He initiated civil proceedings to have Constance declared unfit to manage the estate, citing her documented disregard for the financial value of enslaved property. The 18 deaths represented a significant loss of capital, after all. In the twisted economics of slavery, this argument carried weight that moral considerations never could. The civil case proceeded through late August and into September. Constance, advised by lawyers from Mobile, mounted a defense that acknowledged her methods were unconventional, but insisted they had achieved their primary purpose, unprecedented productivity that had saved Belhaven from financial ruin. Her attorneys argued that the mortality rate, while regrettable, was not significantly higher than what occurred on other plantations when adjusted for the intensity of labor required during peak harvest season. The argument was coldly calculated, and horrifyingly, it had some legal merit. Plantation owners were generally given wide latitude in management decisions, and productivity was indeed the ultimate measure of success in the agricultural economy. That Constance had achieved this productivity through psychological exploitation rather than physical brutality made her methods unusual, but not necessarily illegal. But public opinion, particularly among the planter class, had turned decisively against Constance. Not because they were horrified by the exploitation itself, the entire system of slavery was built on exploitation, but because she had violated fundamental social boundaries. A white woman of the planter class engaging in deliberate intimacy with enslaved men threatened the entire ideological structure that justified slavery and white supremacy. The whispered conversations at church socials and dinner parties condemned Constance not for cruelty, but for impropriety, for degrading herself, and by extension all white womanhood. This social pressure ultimately accomplished what legal proceedings could not. In late September, facing complete ostracism from Alabama society, and the likelihood that her reputation would make future business dealings impossible, Constance agreed to a settlement. She would relinquish management of Belhaven to Preston Granger, accepting a modest financial settlement in exchange for leaving Alabama permanently. The plantation would be sold, the proceeds used to settle remaining debts and compensate Preston for assuming management responsibilities. Constance would depart for New Orleans, where her history was unknown, and never return to Wilcox County. The enslaved population of Belhaven faced their own uncertain future. In October, as part of the plantation's liquidation, most were sold to other properties throughout the Black Belt region. Families were separated, communities dispersed. The brief, horrifying experiment at Belhaven dissolved into the broader machinery of slavery. Isaac was among those sold, purchased by a planter in neighboring Dallas County, who had heard of his extraordinary productivity, but nothing of the methods that had driven it. In his new situation, Isaac worked adequately but never exceptionally. The fire that had pushed him to impossible achievements extinguished, along with the twisted rewards that had fueled it. Ruth, whose testimony had exposed the truth, faced the retaliation Constance had threatened. Before departing Alabama, Constance ensured that Ruth's children were sold to a trader heading for the Deep South, separating them from their mother as punishment for betrayal. Ruth lived another 32 years in slavery, never seeing her children again. The price she paid for speaking truth to power. Silas Drummond, the overseer who had administered Constance's system, found himself unemployable throughout the region. No planter would hire a man associated with such scandal, regardless of his actual culpability. He eventually left Alabama, drifting west toward Texas territory, disappearing from historical record. Dr. Ephraim Caldwell, whose complaints to the medical board had triggered the final investigation, maintained his practice in Wilcox County, but never spoke publicly about the Belhaven case again. His private journals, discovered after his death in 1867, revealed that he considered the entire affair evidence of slavery's corrupting influence on human morality. that a system built on treating people as property inevitably created opportunities for exploitation limited only by individual imagination and conscience. Constance Granger herself vanished into New Orleans society under a different name. Unconfirmed reports from the 1850s suggested she had remarried to a wealthy merchant who knew nothing of her past and lived comfortably until her death from yellow fever in 1853. Whether she felt remorse for the 18 men who died pursuing her calculated rewards, history does not record. Preston Granger assumed control of Belhaven's remains, selling the property in parcels and settling the debts that had driven Constance to her desperate experiments. He profited modestly from the liquidation, but never spoke of his sister-in-law except to warn other planters against innovative management techniques that violate the natural order of society. The production records from Belhaven's final season, that impossible 47% increase, remained in plantation archives for decades, studied by agricultural experts seeking to understand what methods had achieved such extraordinary yields. But the true explanation, the psychological exploitation that had driven those numbers, was deliberately obscured in official accounts. The story became a whispered legend, a cautionary tale shared privately among planter families about the dangers of allowing women to manage plantations without proper male supervision. The leather-bound journal, the most damning evidence of Constance's systematic exploitation, disappeared from official custody sometime in the 1850s. Some historians believe it was deliberately destroyed by family members seeking to protect the Granger name. Others suggest it may still exist, hidden in some private collection or forgotten archive, waiting to be rediscovered. What we know with certainty comes from fragments, court documents, personal letters, Dr. Caldwell's private journals, and the testimony preserved in medical board records. These pieces paint a picture of an experiment in human exploitation that revealed uncomfortable truths about the machinery of slavery itself. Constance Granger had discovered that human beings could be more effectively controlled through the promise of recognition and dignity than through traditional brutality. She had found that the hunger for humanity, for acknowledgement of one's worth, could drive people to self-destruction more efficiently than any whip or chain. And she had documented this discovery with scientific precision, treating human suffering as data points in her study of maximum productivity. The horror of Belhaven was not that it represented an aberration in the slavery system, but that it revealed the system's logical extremes. If human beings could be owned as property, then every aspect of their humanity could be weaponized for profit. Constance simply had the intelligence and ruthlessness to identify which vulnerabilities could be most effectively exploited. The 18 men who died at Belhaven, Joseph, Daniel, Caleb, and 15 others whose names appear only in mortality records, became footnotes in history, their individual stories lost to time. They were men who responded to the promise of dignity with desperate hope, who worked themselves to death, pursuing brief moments when they were treated as human beings rather than property. Their tragedy was not unique to Belhaven, but it was uniquely documented, preserved in Constance's clinical observations and the testimonies of those who witnessed the system's effects. In the decades that followed, as the Civil War destroyed the plantation system and Reconstruction attempted to rebuild Southern society, the story of Belhaven remained hidden, too disturbing to fit comfortable narratives of either slavery's cruelty or its paternalistic benevolence. It was a story that suggested the worst exploitation might come not from hatred, but from calculated intelligence applied to human vulnerability. Today, the land where Belhaven once stood has been subdivided and developed, the plantation house long since demolished. The fields where men once competed for deadly rewards, now hosting modern homes and shopping centers. No historical marker commemorates what happened there. No museum exhibit explains the system Constance Granger created. But in the archives of Wilcox County, in the fragmentary records that survived deliberate suppression, the story persists. It remains as evidence of what human beings are capable of when power meets desperation, when intelligence serves cruelty, when the promise of humanity becomes a tool for exploitation. The question that haunted Dr. Caldwell's later writings continues to resonate. Was Constance Granger uniquely evil, or was she simply more honest about the mechanisms of slavery than her contemporaries? Did she create something new, or did she merely expose what had always been present in a system built on treating human beings as property? History offers no comfortable answers, only the disturbing record of what occurred when one woman, facing financial ruin and social extinction, discovered that the human need for recognition could be deadlier than any physical punishment ever devised. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there darker secrets still buried in the Alabama soil? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. If you want more historical mysteries that challenge our understanding of the past, subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the dark complexities of American history. These stories need to be told, need to be remembered, because only by confronting the full truth of our past can we understand the present. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another chapter of history that refuses to stay buried.